Tonight, we're going to have a really special program. I think most of you know Jeff Mullenhour. He's done programs for us before. Jeff is a true naturalist. He has an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. And that curiosity is the basis for anybody's knowledge. To want to, when you have a curiosity about something, knowledge follows because you can't help yourself finding out. And Jeff has amassed an amazing array of facts and information and understandings about the natural world through his many roads he's gone down for birds and insects and all the other things that are out there in the natural world. And then he has the enthusiasm to share that with everybody else. So that's the winning combination for someone to give a program for us. I think we all remember that in 2021, Jeff was the coordinator for the Big Year Echo System, a Big Year Echo Challenge, which was a wonderful event. I took part of that at Tall Pines, and a number of other people out here at other sites as well. And we learned so much about the places that are all around us, that are right in our neighborhoods. And now we're going to have, as Jeff says, the Big Year in the Dark. The program is on the moths and nocturnal insects of Gloucester County. It's a hidden world that comes alive when the sun goes down. And he's going to explore that world for us tonight. So please give a very warm welcome to Jeff Mullenhour and Big Year in the Dark.
Thank you. So as Rich was saying, I know a lot of you were here last year. I gave the program on the Big Year Eco Challenge. And I wasn't quite sure. That was all of 2021. We all spent a lot of time working on that. I spent a lot of time working on that. And when I got to 2022, I wasn't quite sure which direction I was going to go in 2022. And I gave the program here probably around the same time of year in 2022 in May. And it wasn't until about a week or two after the program that I kind of started going down the journey that led me into the Big Year in the Dark, and where I really got focused on nocturnal insects. So what I want to do tonight is kind of walk you through that story of how I got interested in the nocturnal insects, share with you some of my methods for how I observe the nocturnal insects and how I photograph nocturnal insects, and then mainly just kind of highlight some of that biodiversity of the nocturnal insects, because there's so many different species that are active at night. It was really, when I first got into it, I was blown away by how much there was that we missed during the Big Year Eco Challenge, because during the Big Year Eco Challenge, most of us were so focused during the daytime that we didn't get out at night to see what was going on at night, and it's like a whole different world. I mean, when I say we missed so much, I think what I documented last year equally surpassed. It was the same number of species, if not more, at night than we documented during the day last year. So it's really amazing. So interestingly, the story starts with a bathroom. I can honestly say this is probably the first presentation I've ever given where my second slide into the program is a picture of a bathroom. But about 2 weeks after the Big Year Eco Challenge program here, I went on a camping trip with my family. We went up to Hickory Run State Park in Pennsylvania. When we got there, we set up our camp. It was starting to get dark, and a few of us walked up to the bathroom. And when we got there, you can maybe make out there's like a little light fixture here on the side of the bathroom. As you can imagine, it's a state park, so it's pretty dark, but they light up the bathrooms there, so the bathrooms are all well lit up. And so as we walked up to the bathroom, we saw on each side of the light was a Luna moth. A beautiful green Luna moth on either side of the light, so there was two of them. And we were just like blown away by how fresh and nice the Luna moths looked, and so we were looking at the Luna moths for a while, and then and then we walked back and got some of the other folks, and we're showing them the Luna moths. And then, as we were looking at the Luna moths, I happened to look over on one of these brown panels and saw another moth. And I took some pictures of that, put it in iNaturalist, and lo and behold, that's a maple looper moth. And so I was like, oh, maple looper moth, okay. And then I'm still looking around, and I see on one of the screens from the windows, there's another moth, a different kind of moth. It's an oak besma moth. And I'm like, okay, wow. So I'm just like seeing all these new moths, and then I'm starting to remember, my brain's starting to turn a little bit, and I'm starting to remember some of the stuff that I learned during the big year, but never really got to apply because we were so busy looking at stuff during the day. I remember, all right, so at night, the insects aren't all active at the same time. You have like some insects that are active early in the night and some that are active, later into the night. So you can kind of almost get like waves of different species coming throughout the night. And so I'm starting to wonder then, like as I'm seeing more and more moths on the, bathroom, like all right, this is like 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night. What's it going to look like at like closer to like midnight? And so then we go back down to the tents, and then when everybody's getting ready for bed, I go back up, and I'm like at this point, I'm kind of looking around, and I go back, and the Luna moths are still sitting there, but next to the Luna moths is a rosy maple moth, and so now you have this beautiful like pink and yellow moth that's up there, and I'm like, okay, this is really cool, and so I'm like totally hooked at this point. I'm like, all right. Like I can't go to bed because I need to see like what else is going to show up on this bathroom. And so at this point I'm no longer just like scanning the front wall here. I'm like, all right, so there's a light here that stuff's coming into, but there's also like a light in the entryway to the men's bathroom. Like what's coming in there? And so I'm like poking around in there. Meanwhile, there's like people coming into the bathroom. And they're like, what is this guy doing in here? And so I'm kind of having to like explain myself to people as they walk up, like, no, I'm just taking pictures of the moths. And I'm like walking, and then they're kind of like looking at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, no, come see this Luna moth. And then they're like, oh, that's really cool, So I could use some of the moths as props to kind of like make people realize I wasn't a crazy person. There's kind of a different story around the lady side. Like you had to be more careful on the lady side because then you're really suspicious. So I mainly staked out like the front side and the men's side and walked around the back side some. There was like a washer, there was some sinks around the back side, so there's different stuff coming over there. But anyway, like I was up until like 1 o'clock in the morning, scouring this bathroom, and then at some point I was like, all right, I gotta go to bed. But I was like, all right, these lights are gonna be on all night, so then I'm wondering like, is there still stuff gonna be there in the morning? So then as soon as like the light comes up, I'm like up to the bathroom again to look and see what's new on the bathroom, and there's a pale metanema moth, and there's a saddled yellowhorn moth, and then another brilliant idea clicks in my head. I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't the only bathroom in the campground. So I'm like, what's going on in the other rooms? So then I'm like doing like a bathroom tour of those. So I'm like going from one bathroom to the next, and as I get to the next bathroom, there's an arched hooktip moth, or there's a hickory tussock moth, and so then I'm just like for the rest of the trip I was like, every night walking the bathrooms, like walking the different loops. In the mornings, going to check and see what was new. There might be like a nice tiger moth. But it was just, I had so much fun on that trip that I was like so hooked in at that point. By the time that trip was over, I was like, all right, I gotta figure out how to do this like at home. And my methods up there for photographing the moths were so crude at that point because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was mainly using my telephoto lens, and I had like a headlamp, and I was like trying to shine it on the moth and like take the pictures, and really I was getting my best photos in the morning when the light came out. It was much harder for me to get the photos at night. But once I had time to get back and think about this and read more about how to do how to do some of the lighting for moths at night, I kind of gathered some equipment. I realized that I was going to need a UV flashlight. Over here, I have my UV flashlight. Looks just like a regular flashlight, but when you turn it on, it's I don't know if you guys can see that. It has like a purplish cast to it, like the UV. And a lot of insects are more attracted to UV light. And it's really poorly understood why insects are attracted to light at all. But it's well established that insects do come into light, and in particular more so to UV light. So essentially what I do is I'll set up like a white bed sheet. You can see a picture of it over here on the right. I take a clothesline or a guy line and string it between two trees, maybe about 10, 15 feet apart. And then I use clothespins to get the sheet onto the line. And then I'll weigh down the bottom of the sheet with a log or some rocks, just to make, if it's at all windy, your sheet starts like blowing around, so you have to have something to weigh the bottom down. Otherwise, it's really hard to take pictures because you have a moving sheet at that point. And also, the moths don't like it when the sheet is moving; they don't stay on as well. But essentially, the sheet gives the moths something to grip onto. So they come in, see the light, and then you have the light, that purple UV light shining on the sheet, and they'll grip onto it and stay on it. And what I found ultimately worked really well for me for taking pictures was using my macro lens. I have a Canon 70D that I put a 65 millimeter macro lens on, and I have a flash mounted to the front of that.
What depth of field? F-stop?
Oh, f-stop, I usually use 7.1. And it kind of depends. Sometimes I'll move it around a little bit, usually at 250. So essentially, I have a twin light flash that's mounted to the front. And then the macro, this is really good for your small to medium-sized moths. I'd say moths that are probably smaller than the size of a $50 or a quarter, this would work on. And then you can go down as small as, what's nice about this is you can go down as small as stuff that's like smaller than an ant, and you get good pictures of it, because there's some moths that are really tiny. And then anything larger than the size of a $50, you can pretty much get with your phone, with your cell phone and a headlamp. And if you just shine, you get a light source like your headlamp on it. The bigger ones are a little bit easier to get with your phone. So essentially, the nice thing about the twin light flash is that I have a guide light on it. So if you can see that, like I can shine the guide light on the moths and be able to see what I'm looking at. So it's not totally dark on the moths, and be able to get the pictures that way. And using the flash on the front, I don't need any light source. I don't need to be shining my headlamp on it or anything. So that works really well for me. But it took a little bit of trial and error to figure all this out. So when I first got back from that Hickory Run trip, I tried a couple times setting up in my backyard. I had some moths and nocturnal insects come in, but not as much success as I had at the bathrooms at Hickory Run. So I'm still trying to figure out how can I recreate that. What was so special about those bathrooms? And then I tried a little bit. I thought maybe it was because there's too many lights in our neighborhood, and so I tried like a slightly more rural area, and I got a little bit more. But then I still was thinking, like, I need to go somewhere like Hickory Run. Hickory Run was dark. Like, there was, those bathrooms were like the only good light source around. And I was thinking, like, they're just drawing everything in. I need to be the thing that is drawing everything in. And so, at some point in June, I was like, all right, I'm just going to head out. Like, I saw that they closed the gates at Glassboro Wildlife Management Area, and I was like, I'm just gonna park and walk in and set up a sheet and hope I don't get in trouble. And so I did that, and the whole time I'm thinking like somebody's like gonna come back here and yell at me for being back here. But I set up my sheet. You can see like the purplish glow of the sheet here at dusk. And I'm waiting for it to get dark, and then as soon as it starts getting dark, like all of this stuff starts coming in, and I'm like, wow, okay, this was what I was like, hoping for. And so I'm getting like Hebrew moths, these black and white checkered moths called a Hebrew moth because supposedly some of their markings resemble letters from the Hebrew alphabet. Things like cloaked marvel, and these different types of moths called slug moths. This one is an early button slug moth. You can usually tell it's a slug moth because their abdomen points up. Like they have these little wings that point down, and then the tip of their abdomen is usually sticking up. And same thing, this is another type of slug moth called a yellow-shouldered slug moth. And then another type of slug moth is really pretty. This is a green Parasa slug moth. You might be wondering at this point, like, why are they called slug moths? They get called slug moths because of their larvae, the caterpillars. They are very unique. This is a stinging rose caterpillar slug moth. And the larvae, if you think of caterpillars having kind of rudimentary legs, the larvae for slug moths don't really have any legs at all. They have suckers, and they move across the leaf like a slug would move across the leaf. They kind of work their way along the leaf very gradually, and they have, you can see these spines, pretty characteristic. You don't want to touch this kind of caterpillar. It's called stinging rose caterpillar for a reason. It can pack a pretty good sting. I've been stung by this one here before. This is a saddleback slug caterpillar, and you can take my word for it. It hurt. But so at this point, again, this was so successful at Glassboro Woods. I was like, okay, now I got this figured out. I got a good setup. I know I need to get somewhere dark. And I thought so I was telling my friend John Stimick about this. Some of you may know John. And he was like, oh, you found all those things? He's like, I'd love to come do that with you. So I was like, all right, well then let's go down to, I think the next spot we did was Piney Hollow. We set up a night, we went out to Piney Hollow together. And by this point I was like, I don't want just one sheet, I want 2 sheets. So I was like, so John and I set up 2 sheets. And so we're going back and forth between the 2 sheets, and we're getting things like Io moths. And this is the first night that John and I ever saw Io moths, and we're like, oh my gosh, these things are amazing. They're big. So you're talking like a moth that's probably about this big, and beautiful, yellow and reddish colors. Things like painted lichen moths. They're called lichen moths because the caterpillars actually feed on lichens. Another type of lichen moth that we saw was Packard's lichen moth. And yellow-winged leaf rollers. And then as John, so at this point John's totally hooked too. He's like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. So then John goes out and gets them all set up. So he's got 2 sheets, I've got 2 sheets. And then we learned about how you could bait for moths. So not just setting up lights, but some moths are actually, if you see in this picture here, this is a lunate Zale moth. You'll see this brownish goo here. That's actually a mix of fermented fruit. So they really like fermented bananas. So if you get old brown bananas, and mix that with some beer, maybe some rum, some brown sugar, some molasses. They love that. They love that mix. And so you paint a little bit of that on a tree, and then you wait to see what comes in. A lot of times you get a lot of ants, but you also get some of these really cool moths that come in and will be like feeding on that on your mix that you put out. So at this point, like John and I are running around, we're setting up like, you know, we're going to different places, we're setting up our lights, we're setting up some bait trees to see what comes in. And we're getting things like another type of Zale moth. This is a green dusted Zale. And then as the summer goes along, then we get to like July, and there's a moth event in Scotland Run, which I highly recommend. Like if they do it again this summer, they had a lot of really neat stuff there that came in. They had a number of good like entomologists there that were explaining lots about the moths and nocturnal insects. But they do that like during International Moth Week, I think, in July. So it was there that we learned about a type of moth called underwing moths. There's a whole group of moths called the underwings. This is a coastal graphic, but you can see right now it has its wings closed. So moths, like butterflies, have like 4 wings. And what you're seeing here is you're just seeing the front wings, but they have underneath, when they spread those 2 top wings, you see the hind wing here, and that hind wing or underwing is often a much different color than the top wing for those underwing moths. So in a lot of cases it's an orange pattern on there. And so we learned at that moth event at Scotland Run that if you a lot of times the moths have their wings closed on the sheet, and if you just slightly like tickle the back of their wing with your finger, a lot of times they'll pop those wings open and you get to see what's underneath. And so then when we saw things like a widow underwing, we would kind of employ that technique, and you get to see that the widow underwing has a black hind wing, no orange on it, all black. Interestingly too, the widow or the underwings, a lot of them were named by Carl Linnaeus, and he had a really good time apparently naming a lot of them after giving them very like feminine names like widow underwing or bride underwing. He had a whole variety of different feminine descriptors that he would use for those moths. Well, I'm sure they're all probably out of date now with a lot of his terminology, but that's where they got the names. This is the Ultronia underwing. And then we also learned at that Scotland Run event that a lot of your larger moths, like the Saturnids, this one here is a Promethea silk moth on the left. On the right you have a Polyphemus moth. A lot of those moths don't get active until much later in the night. So if you want to set up a moth light and try to get some of the larger moths, they said at the event at Scotland Run that you usually have to wait until almost midnight before some of the larger moths get active. So again, like going back to that idea of you have different insects flying at different times of the night, those large moths are active much later. And sure enough, like when we did that event at Scotland Run, almost exactly on midnight, one of those Polyphemus moths showed up. But I just want to highlight too, a lot of times I think people tend to think of moths as being less colorful than butterflies. Just to highlight some of the different colors of moths, because it's just amazing. This is a bicolored Pyrausta moth. Again, all of these are found here in Gloucester County too. A pink bordered yellow moth, a pond-side crambid moth, usually found near wetlands. There's a variety of emerald moths that are green. This is a red fringed emerald. You also have a pistachio emerald, green with orange borders. You have some moths that even have some pinkish coloration. So this is a pink shaded fern moth. Here you have a a laudable arches moth. I don't know who named the arches moths, but there's like laudable arches, explicit arches. They have some funny names too. A mottled gray carpet moth. And also just to highlight some of that, what fascinated me too was just some of the adaptations that moths have. This is an olive shaded bird dropping moth. There's a variety of moths that have their caterpillars and their adults that are adapted to look like bird droppings to avoid predation. This is a deadwood borer moth. And when we first saw this, I was like, oh, that's a really interesting name, the deadwood borer moth. And then we read some more about it, and its name actually comes from the fact that the caterpillars, you tend to think of caterpillars feeding on leaves, but their caterpillars actually are found in dead, rotting logs, and it's not completely known what they feed on. They might be feeding on the wood, or they might be feeding on fungi within the rotting log. But whatever they're feeding on, it's not leaves. They're feeding inside the dead, rotting log. And so you can actually see, like John and I have found, we were lucky enough to stumble upon one of the larvae. But you can see here the larvae, and you can see all the frass within the log where it's been eating away within the log. Then there's also, we found one of these boxwood leaf tire moths. You might think that's a very strange shape for a moth. And initially when I saw it come in, I thought, we're not just getting moths that come into the sheets, there's a variety of insects, and I did not think this was a moth when it first came in. I thought, oh, that's an assassin bug, because it came in, it has the typical shape of like an assassin bug. Here you can see, like, just for reference, that this would be an assassin bug here. That same type of shape of the back. And it actually came in, it was like walking across the log at the bottom of the sheet, just like an assassin bug would walk. And I was like, that is so cool. And so I came back and I read more about it, and sure enough, they think that is an assassin bug mimic. This one is one of my few pictures up here that's not a moth that's found in New Jersey, but I just thought the mimicry is so cool on this. I had to put it in. This one is a moth that I photographed down in Texas, called the Texas wasp moth. It mimics Polistes wasps. So you can see like the wings and the antenna, the legs are just like such cool mimicry of wasps. Even in flight, when they fly, the back legs dangle like a wasp would. It's just so cool. And then there's also so many moths that are just tiny. Like we're talking, if you can imagine a small ant, a lot of these moths are like the size of those tiny little like sugar ants that you might see in your house or on the sidewalk. And you can't even see the color on them when you look at them. It's not until you get zoomed in on them and magnify them that you can see what the coloration is on them. And then you're just like blown away by like, oh my gosh, like that little thing is those colors. This is an orange-headed Epicolenia moth. The next set of moths that I'm going to show you are all these really tiny little moths. People sometimes refer to them as the micro moths. This is a Suzuki's Promolactis moth. Yellow wave. Beautiful Cosmopteryx. And the red streaked Mompha. A lot of times these moths, if you've ever heard me talk about the leaf miners, a lot of these moths are leaf miners. They're larvae or leaf miners, so it's always funny to me to like get one of these on the sheet and see it and photograph it, and then realize like, oh yeah, I've seen the leaf mines for that species. And a lot of times, like you pick them up near the areas where their host plant is, and that's one of the other really cool things that I've learned about doing these nocturnal surveys is that habitat is so important in terms of where you set up for those nocturnal surveys. a lot of times the moths are only found within a certain distance from their host plant. So you could set your moth sheet up, you know, in one spot and like 50 yards away set up another sheet and you get like completely different stuff because you're next to different host plants. So it's really kind of interesting how small that world is that's out there at night too. So as I mentioned, it's not just moths that come into the sheet. It's also a wide variety of beetles too, which I was really stunned by some of the beetles that we were seeing out there. This is a red-banded fungus beetle. This is a red rot decay stag beetle. So you can see gets its name from what looks like it has like the mandibles look like horns on the front. This is a fiery searcher beetle. This is a nighttime predator of other insects. So they're quite fast, and I've heard we've only seen them a couple times. I think we had them at the event out at Scott and Run, but I've heard that they're one of the few things that will come in and take moths off your sheet. So a lot of times we will have like some spiders moving around the sheets that will do some predation, but most of the time stuff that comes in, because John and I tend not to set up stuff for more than one night, a lot of times the predators don't figure out that's a light source. But I think if you set up in the same place night after night after night, predators would figure out like, ooh, this is a really good food source. And then there's a whole group of beetles called longhorn beetles that I find really fascinating. They get the name longhorn beetles. You can see the antennae are quite long and thin on the front. This is a banded longhorn beetle. This is an arrowhead borer. Again, another longhorn. You can see the long antenna. Banded Graphosaurus beetle. And this is a round-headed apple borer beetle. Again, another longhorn. You can clearly see the antennae are almost longer than the length of the body. And then and another group of beetles that I find also equally fascinating is the weevils. And a small beetle, but they have these amazing rostrums. You can see this one has a very long rostrum, and this is Curculio in the genus Curculio. It's one of the acorn or nut weevils, and they use that long rostrum to bore into acorns or hickory nuts. So you can see here, these are some hickory nuts. Pretty much if you have a hickory in your yard or somewhere nearby, I guarantee if you go out and like kind of flip through some of those hickory nuts, you'll find some of those bore holes in them. Same thing with acorns. A lot of times if you go through and look at acorns, you can find some of those bore holes. And essentially the weevil bores a hole, the adult weevil bores a hole and then lays eggs. The females lay eggs, and the larvae will feed on the inside of the nut and then mature. But there's other types of weevils too. There's Candium curculio, the plum curculio. You can see a lot of times they'll try to hide or make themselves look camouflage on the leaf or when they're on the sheet. Sometimes you can see this one has its top legs like kind of like tucked up in a position to make it look like it's not a weevil, almost like it's hiding. This is a Pales weevil. You can see it has some spots on the back. And then there's a whole variety of beetles, all kind of like those micro moths that are so small that they're smaller than an ant. And you look at it and you're like, I don't know what that speck is on the sheet. And then you get a good picture of it and you're like, wow, that's so cool looking. This is one of those. This is another type of weevil in the genus Euplatypus. It's got these funny little round antennae. We saw a couple types of small beetles that are in a group of beetles called Monoceros. Mono meaning one, ceros meaning horn, kind of like rhinoceros, but monoceros. And it's because they have this weird looking hump that comes out there like a horn. This is Notoxis muropennis. And some of the things, when you get really specific with the small stuff, some of it doesn't have common names, it's all just genus and species names for these guys. So Notoxis desertus for this one. Another one of the monoceros beetles. You can see the horn there. And then if you guys have ever seen on bark or underneath bark, if you've seen like the lines under bark, this is a bark beetle. It's one of those types of beetles that makes those lines underneath bark on trees. You'll see like on dead wood sometimes. This is a yellow-banded timberworm. But again, it's not just beetles too. It's not just beetles and moths. There's other insects that come in. And this was one of the other groups that just fascinate John and I. This is the leaf hoppers and tree hoppers. So this is an 8-lined leaf hopper. Rhododendron leaf hopper.
Say that again?
Rhododendron leaf hopper. So associated with rhododendron bushes. This is Sterellus bicolor. Again, some of these guys don't have common names. They should though. Like this, something like this. I was like, that doesn't have a common name, really? Hylozygus bifidus. This one's the saddled leaf hopper. And then you get some tree hoppers that just have these like amazing long like horn-like structures or almost like a sail on the back. This one is Glossinotus turriculatus. And here you have Arcasia belfragi, another tree hopper. And then sometimes you just get really strange stuff, like this one is a giant water bug. So sometimes when you set up near water systems, marshes, or you get aquatic insects that can fly and will come in. And this this giant water bug is actually, I believe it's the largest Hemiptera in North America. So it's as big as some of the largest beetles. But it's actually in Hemiptera. It has these long, like raptorial appendages on the front. It uses that to, it's a predatory bug. It uses that to grasp its prey, and then similar to like the assassin bugs, it has a sucking mouth part that it'll use to kind of drain its victim. Also called, I believe they're also called toe biters. I didn't put my finger too close. And then you get some very strange and interesting looking flies. This is an owl fly with the big kind of bug eyes. They're, I'm drawing a blank. They're closely related to the lacewings. So like lacewings would be one of their close relatives. But you also, on the other side on the right, you have fish flies. I know you saw some of these during the day, during the big year, but they are particularly active at night. So you'll see them flying around. You might think it's a moth, but then you get a closer look, you're like, oh, it's a fish fly.
How long is that?
The fish,
on the right.
the one on the right here?
No.
Oh, sorry, the fish fly on the right? Probably about that long. Yeah.
2.5, 3.
Yeah, they're pretty good size insect. They're related to Dobson flies too. Dobson flies are a little bigger than the fish flies. But again, usually found near water. So if you're in some sort of like aquatic system, you would pick them up. And then another one that's related to the lacewings that's pretty cool is the mantid flies. So they look like a bit like a praying mantis. They have those, again, the raptorial front appendages that they'll use for catching other insects. But they're actually, again, they're lacewing and they fly around and they'll land on your sheet. So the last one here was a green manted fly, and then we also have another species called Say's manted fly. It's more of a brownish coloration. So in ending tonight, I just wanted to point out that one, this is just a small fraction of the species that John and I documented over the past year. I think I maybe put up about 40, 45 moth species tonight. John and I documented over 600 species of moths in Gloucester County last year. So if that seemed like a lot tonight, that's only a small fraction of just what we documented in Gloucester County last year. Same for the beetles. I put up about 15 beetles. I think we've documented over 200 in Gloucester County. And many other insects too. Lots more leaf hoppers and tree hoppers. But I didn't want to overwhelm you all tonight with too much. And if you want to help nocturnal insects, one of my big takeaways from everything that I've been doing out there is that really light pollution is a big thing for insects. The reason why it's hard for me to do any nocturnal work in my backyard is because there's so many lights and so many other sources that are drawing insects in, and you just feel bad for the insects that are it's not dark and they're getting drawn in and trapped in all these different backyard porch lights or there's different recommendations on things you can do to reduce. I know one of the big things. If you remember at the beginning, I was showing that light on the bathroom that was like an open light that kind of shines out in every direction. What they recommend is buying lights that are downward facing. So if it's like shaded on top and it creates the light angle more downward, then that will reduce the risk of kind of like spreading that light out everywhere and making it more attractive to insects. So if you angle it just down to the sources where you want it, if you want your front walkway to be lit and you have that light that's shaded and angled downward, that'll work fine for your purpose, but it won't like broadcast that light out to all the insects. So that's one of the things that they recommend as bug-friendly lights, downward facing. And just in general, like turning off lights that you don't need, or that'll really help out insects.
What about a colored light, like green
I think I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like if I think there is different colors that are less attractive to insects, but I'm not sure offhand. Like.
My neighbor complained that my light was bothering her shining in her bedroom.
Okay.
So I put a green light there. It's not
Okay.
very bright.
Okay.
I've never seen bugs around it.
Okay. Well then, yeah. Then if you don't see bugs around it, then it's probably okay. Yeah. And then just remembering that all of these native insects that you see, they are very important. If you're a bird lover, if you're somebody who likes flowers or plants, those native insects are so important for our native wildlife. That's what our birds and animals all depend on for food source. And then a lot of those insects are important pollinators. There's just as much pollination that's going on at night that we don't see that's going on during the daytime. So a lot of those moths and beetles are very important pollinators. And also if you're interested more in some of that like nocturnal world, John and I are hosting several moth events. So we already mentioned in the program here tonight on June 10th that at Alcyon Park. We'll have one there. I haven't done any mothing there yet, so I have no idea what to expect. I know there are, that area probably has more lights around it than some other areas, so I don't know what to expect, but there will be some other moth events, definitely in darker areas. I think John's going to do one down at Malaga Lake, which we've done a couple times last year, which was really good. And there might be Scotland Run, as I mentioned before, which was really nice. I don't run that one. That's set up by Scotland Run and Dan Duran. But that was in July last year, and if they do that again, I would highly recommend that one. There's a lot of really good expert entomologists there. They did a nice program. So that is all I have for tonight. Okay. Yeah.
Have there been any studies done to show that some of them are increasing and some are declining among the moths?
That's a really good question. Something I didn't talk about. Actually, a lot of them are declining. If you read the current literature, they talk about insect Armageddon, which is or insect apocalypse. Basically, with a lot of there's a lot of reasons why they might be declining. Use of pesticides, the light pollution at night. It gets harder and harder to find areas that aren't really well lit up at night. I think that Dad was just sharing before the presentation tonight that what was the statistic that you said since 1970 in England, 80% decline of moths?
Yeah, so I have a book here which is a story of an area of England that's being rewilded. In other words, they're trying to get it back to native species. And they cite in here that since 1970 in the United Kingdom, which would be England, Ireland, Scotland, etc., moths have declined 88%. So that's a lot of pollination of plants lost, as well as other things that depend on birds and so on. 88% decline in moths in the United Kingdom, 72% decline of ground beetles, 76% decline of butterflies. So, and I don't know if people have worked out the statistics here, but I'm sure it's pretty bad. We just have so many non-native plants, and if we can rewild some of these areas and get back to natives, what this book shows is that if you do that, you become like a propagator of so many other things, insects and birds. They cite in here some examples of birds that are extremely rare, butterflies extremely rare in other parts of England, but on this 4,000-acre farm they have rewilded. It's become a magnet for people who want to see certain butterflies or certain birds because they've created the habitat, the plants that are producing the insects and the butterflies and the birds. Turtle doves, remember that from the 12 Days of Christmas?
Yeah.
If you want to see turtle doves, this farm, this 2,000-acre farm in southern England in Kent, is the place to see turtle doves, which have been pretty much decimated in England over the years.
Field trip?
Field trip.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you seen many female ions?
Female.
Ions.
Oh, I think we've seen both, I don't remember for sure, but yeah, I think we've had several IOs, yeah, I think so.
I have one from Scotland Run. Would you like to see it?
Do you?
Well, it's not alive. It was
Okay.
alive when I found it.
Oh wow! Oh, very pretty. Wow.
I was going to put down on some phone for you, but
Nice. Beautiful, beautiful picture.
I'm with bluebirds, and we can see the bluebird population suffers for lack of movements. And we can tell when we're banding different nests. If the bugs are weak, the chicks don't grow, and it's real obvious when we're doing it. So we'll go there, normally we band around 10 days, and sometimes we get there and the babies are still pretty small.
Yeah.
So we know it's lack of bugs.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's huge. Like a lot of these insects are native insects, and if they're declining, then that's what that's what, birds like bluebirds and
Yeah.
a lot of our birds depend on for food source, so, yeah.
Do you use sodium vapor at all?
Vapor light? No, we've mainly just been using, the setup that we use is so mobile,
Yeah.
that it allows us to get in without using like, any car battery or anything. So we just run it all off of AA batteries, and so it makes it really easy to get around. My friend John has he has a mercury vapor at his house, that he uses, along with, some of the UV lights. It's pretty successful, but he can also run all the electric out there. And his house, he's out in like Franklinville, so it's much more, it's a more rural area, darker, and he has like the most amazing setup. Like, I'm so jealous, but we'll go hit up his house a bunch. We've already started this spring, doing a bunch there at his house, and he gets like, he has so many new moth species for the county just right there at his house. Yeah.
Then you don't need the same amount of eye protection as with the LED as you do with the sodium vapor, do you think?
Yeah, I think the sodium vapor is, it's definitely, both of them are recommended, like, not to look into the, you don't want to look into the lights. I think the UV that we use is a fairly safe wavelength for the UV.
Yeah.
But yeah, you want to try to avoid looking into
Getting a welder's
any
eye.
lights. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you introduce Small Thing to John, or was he doing it before you?
No, I introduced it to him. So
Wow.
but he does just as much, if not more, than I do now. So because his yard is so convenient, he just like, if there's a good night, he just flips his lights on and then sees what he gets. He can just kind of like do it at will. Whereas for me, it's more of a planned out excursion. So
what makes it a good night? Like weather conditions?
right, yeah, weather conditions. So like this spring, we were looking more for warmer nights. Once we get to the summer, the temperature doesn't really come in as much, but you want the nights to be warm enough that the insects are active and moving around. And then also low wind. If it gets really windy, it's hard to keep the moths on your sheet because the sheet blows around so much that they just disperse. They get like kicked off the sheet, and if they get kicked off the sheet, they might not come back and land on the sheet again. And then also, your best nights are going to be nights where you have less moonlight too. So, like overcast nights or full moon is bad. Full moon, you have too much light out, and it's again, you want to be in an area where your light is like the main light source. And so when you have a full moon, it kind of like washes out everything, and it's harder to draw stuff into your sheet on a full moon.
Is it the imperial moth? The yellow bighorn?
Yes.
Do you find them in abundance?
We saw them, I think I've only seen them once at the Scotland Run event that we did last summer in July.
Groups,
that we
like a
did.
group?
I think they only had one that came in. But yeah, I know. I've seen them come into groups to other people's sheets, but we haven't been lucky enough to see that yet.
Ah, okay.
What precautions do you take, like with the sheet when you're done at night, to make sure you get the bugs off?
Yeah, so usually what we do, that's a good question too. We'll take the sheet and kind of like, if you carefully unclip the top. So you wanna try to like do one clip at a time and kind of gently take the sheet off, because sometimes you get a few moths behind the sheet where it flips over. Because they start to they'll actually come in on both sides of the sheet. So you might have your light shine on this side of the sheet, but they also come in from the back side too. So you kind of have to constantly keep checking both sides of your sheet when you're out there at night. to see what moths are on the front side, what moths are on the back side. But as you can imagine, when you flip that sheet over the string at the top, you have a little bit of a lip, and some moths will crawl up under there, so you kind of have to be careful as you're unclipping, not to like squash anything that's behind there. But then once you have it unclipped, we kind of just gently kind of like mimic like wind on the sheet. You turn your UV lights off and then mimic wind. And as you mimic that wind and start to kind of like shake the sheet, a lot of the stuff will fall off and disperse. Any bigger moths, you might want to like put it on your finger and move it over to a tree, but you can't do that for like, sometimes you have like, 300 little things on your sheet, and you try to take them off and they just fly right back onto the sheet. So that kind of that dispersal method of mimicking wind tends to work pretty well. Once you have your lights off and it's not drawing it back into the sheet, as you kind of like, especially if you have two people, usually John and I will we'll each take a corner and just take it and go up and down, and it'll get everything off, and then you just try to kind of like fold it up before stuff can land back on it again. But it is kind of funny because like as you do that and you're dispersing moths, especially if you have like several hundred things on your sheet, a lot of times this stuff is then landing on you. And so there's been times when John and I will be like walking back to the car, and I'll be like, hold on, stop for a second, you have a moth on your back, or you have a moth on your head. And we'll be trying to like pick moths off of each other and like, put them back on trees or something. Or we'll be like driving down the road after we leave, and there'll be a moth flying around the car, and we'll be trying to like get it out the window, or but it's hard to get everything off and not get it to land back on you. And that's also, I've also found that's a very special skill that you have to kind of like learn as you're out mothing. Is like my gut reaction used to be when an insect would like buzz me, and I do this, like get away from me. But as you're out mothing, like you want those insects to land on your sheet. So you're trying to overcome that instant reaction of like, shoo that thing away from my head. And you almost like have to kind of like just be like, okay, whatever lands on my ear lands on my ear. It's okay.
Like this gentleman was saying, getting things off the sheets, are there ever ticks on the sheets?
Yes, actually there are. I wouldn't say like a lot, but usually you get, I don't know, like I think the last time we were out mothing, we had one dog tick that was walking around the sheet. You get a variety of spiders that walk around the sheet. So some, I think some stuff just comes off of the ground and is kind of wandering around and finds your sheet and starts walking on it. But it shows up like, because it's a white sheet, you see everything that goes across your sheet. So
You're usually hanging on gravel.
Hanging the sheet, we'll put the sheets up pretty much. We've tried in a variety of different habitats. So our main thing is we need like 2 trees and kind of a clear area between the trees. So
Don't worry about the grass on the bottom.
No, or you can have grass or leaves or whatever. Essentially, you have enough sheet left over at the bottom usually that you probably have like, depending on what size sheet you use too. Like if you're using the king size or queen size, but you usually have like a few feet of sheet left over that you're kneeling on at the bottom, which is it actually works better to have a little bit of sheet left over at the bottom, because some stuff comes in and lands on the ground, and you can see it much easier on the sheet than you can in leaf litter or in grass. So it helps to have that extra sheet on the ground to photograph stuff that's on the ground as well as what's hanging on your sheet.
What are you mounting your LED on?
So the LED, I essentially just have a UV flashlight, and I cut a hole in the box that it came in. Very rudimentary setup. And then essentially I'll just take, when we're out there, I'll find a stick or something, and I'll just prop it up, give it a little bit of angle so that it shines up onto the sheet, kind of center of the sheet. Just like you would with a projector for doing the presentations. If you angle it slightly, you kick out the angle, and it'll project right up into the center of the sheet, and then you have like kind of like maybe a neon circle of light about this big in the center of the sheet, and that's enough to bring in a bunch of insects right to the center of your sheet. So. And everybody, from what I've seen, a lot of people that do the work at the nocturnal lighting and stuff has a different setup. So it's very interesting to like see other people's setups and get ideas. And I think everybody kind of works with what works best for either their yard or, you know, in my case, like the yard isn't that good, so I'm trying to get out to other areas, and it's just a little bit easier to have something that I don't have to plug into a battery and carry around. So I'm sure I could probably set it up in different ways and maybe get more stuff, but for the portability of it, it works really well. Yeah.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thank you.